Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is psychiatry and the psychic realm. With me is Dr. Judith Orloff, who is a psychiatrist and a clairvoyant. Dr. Orloff is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA and also the author of a book called Second Sight. Welcome, Judith.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, you have managed to reconcile the opposites, so to speak, in your work.
Yes, absolutely. My hope is that I can see myself as a bridge between two worlds to somehow join the worlds of the paranormal and also of traditional medicine, because how much more natural can it be for physicians to be true healers and to be clairvoyants and seers also?
Yeah. And you know, I think if one goes back far enough into the history of the medical profession, and particularly the psychiatric profession, there was that union. The psychiatrists were like shamans in earlier generations.
Yes, absolutely. The underpinning of spirituality was there in medicine, but we have grown so far from that. Medicine has become so mechanistic and linear and rational that we've lost touch with the visionary side and the spiritual side of medicine.
Yeah. Well, you have been on quite a journey to arrive at the place where you are now, not only where you can practice simultaneously as a psychiatrist and a clairvoyant, but where you can write about it and speak about it publicly. I know it's been a struggle for you.
It has been. It's been many years coming for me to really feel comfortable expressing my clairvoyance and my psychiatric skills together, to really come out of the closet. But with Second Sight coming out, now I am really out of the closet and accepting all of the wonderful things that come with that, and also some of the criticism.
Yes. Let's go back to your childhood. I think really your story starts at a time when you first, or perhaps you didn't even notice as much as perhaps your parents noticed, that you seem to have some unusual abilities.
Yes, I grew up as a psychic child, and I had my first psychic experience at age 9 when I had a dream that my grandfather came to me to let me know that he was dying. Now, in the dream, I wasn't frightened at all, but when I woke up, I was very, very frightened, ran into my parents' room to wake them up, to let them know about the dream. And I said to them, Grandpa came to me in a dream and he told me that he was dying. They basically just looked at me and said, oh no dear, you're just having a nightmare, that's all, and walked me back into my bedroom, tucked me in. The next morning, my aunt called from Philadelphia to let us know that my grandfather had passed on. So that was really my first psychic experience. It was quite disconcerting for me. My parents basically wrote it off as a coincidence, an eerie coincidence, but a coincidence nonetheless, and didn't make much of it.
And you know, if one looks in the annals of psychic research, that kind of an experience is actually rather common.
It's very common. As I've been talking to people around the country, they've been coming to me telling me exactly similar experiences that we all have, and I think these experiences are our legacy, but we've just grown so far from the vision that we can't identify it as such.
The intriguing thing to me in all of this is that actually on your mother's side of the family there's almost a lineage, a history of these kinds of abilities, and your mother, who was a medical doctor herself, tried to protect you from knowing about that.
Yes, consciously withheld some information about my family lineage until she was dying 3.5 years ago. And we would then meet and she would tell me about my grandmother, who was a psychic healer in Philadelphia and a clairvoyant, and herself. She had psychic abilities and healing abilities as a physician, but never told any of her patients, nor did she tell me. And her sister, who's also a physician, who's a psychic, and her daughter, and her little daughter, who's now 9 years old, is already having psychic experiences.
So it seems to be the women in the family.
Yes, the women in my family, definitely on my mother's side. And so I really learned this in the past few years. Many, many missing pieces of the puzzle came together for me. You know, as a child, I never knew this. I had no psychic role models to draw on. I was very frightened. I grew up believing there was something wrong with me, that I had a shameful secret that I was trying to hide, or that I was somehow colluding in the negative events I was able to predict, because every event I predicted was negative, never anything happy. And I didn't know at the time that that was simply because negative events are easier to pick up on a psychic signal. They're just easier, and as I developed my psychic abilities, I found I could sense a whole spectrum of response.
And your mother, although she had these abilities herself, she must have implicitly or even explicitly understood that these are not socially acceptable things to talk about publicly.
Oh yes, her main fear was that if she encouraged my own psychic abilities, that I wouldn't fit in the world, that other people would think I was weird or crazy, and she said she wanted me to be happy. She felt that psychic abilities would impede my own happiness, so she didn't encourage it in me. And however misguided I feel that that was, she was coming from a heart-centered place with concern for me.
And maybe even an appropriate place given the social environment in which you grew up.
Yes, given the social environment that I grew up, but I don't think it's a good role model for parents these days to really not encourage their children. I mean, how different it would have been for me if someone would have come and said to me as a little girl, "Oh dear, you're just having psychic experiences, and this is a wonderful thing that you predicted your grandfather's death because you loved one another so much, and keep it up, and we'll encourage you."
Yeah.
I didn't have any of that.
We don't offer our children those kinds of role models.
Not enough, but we need to.
And in fact, as you came to learn, as you studied medicine and psychiatry, that even talking about these things, expressing an interest in these things in the old days was considered symptomatic of mental illness.
It is even now in the DSM-3, which is the Bible of the American Psychiatric Association, with every diagnostic criteria known to man in it.
Yeah.
Anything psychic is equated with psychosis, a symptom of mental disorder. And that's the only frame of reference that traditional psychiatry has to use to talk about it. So either as a symptom of mental disorder, or else alternatively, psychiatrists see it as a sham.
Well, now there is a DSM-4, or there will be.
Yes,
soon.
there is a DSM-4, and it's the same in the DSM-4. Absolutely, it's the same. It's a very rigid definition that's so restrictive and limited to only the experiences that psychiatrists have in terms of viewing second sight or clairvoyance. As unfortunately, we see in medical school, in medical training, a lot of psychotics who are blatantly psychotic, delusional, hearing the voices of the devil talking to them, also claiming to be psychic and clinging to it like a life raft that just instills dignity in them. And so this is the only model that psychiatrists see, and so they automatically associate it with psychosis and don't see any larger model that can include the psychic as a positive, healthy, visionary side of ourselves that is ever expansive.
You, since you've become a psychiatrist, have worked with the Spiritual Emergence Network, in which they have a different model, and I was under the impression that that model, a model of looking at what might be thought of as spiritual emergencies, psychic disorders, not psychiatric, I thought that was being incorporated into the new diagnostic system of psychiatry.
No, not in the new diagnostic system, but in the new paradigm in which many physicians, or a number of physicians, are breaking away and establishing wonderful groups like the Spiritual Emergence Network to bring spiritual awareness into looking at so-called mental disorders and making a much larger perspective in dealing with psychiatry than simply the linear, logical, rational, or biochemical elements of what's going on in any disorder. And so the SEN is a wonderful group, but it is by no means the average for traditional psychiatry. Traditional psychiatry does not include spiritual elements in its
SEN
diagnosis.
is Spiritual Emergence Network.
Yes, exactly.
For our viewers who may not have caught that. Now, you're obviously a very successful professional today. You're on the faculty at UCLA. Yet growing up with your sensitivities was a painful experience for you.
It was very painful, and I closed off, and as a child I grew smaller and smaller and smaller within myself because I was so ashamed of this so-called sensitivity or ability that I had no way to integrate in my life, and so I ran from it. And I ran from it for a number of years as a teenager. And it really took a number of situations in my life to get me on the right path. A number of synchronicities and wonderful angels who came into my life, mentors, people like Dr. Thelma Moss, Stephen Schwartz of Mobius, who came into my life and really demystified the psychic.
But it seems, as I recall your autobiography, that it really took an automobile accident to sort of begin the process of waking up.
It really did. I mean, what happened was in the late 1960s, the way that I dealt with my psychic abilities was to go towards drugs, because I found that drugs completely shut them off. And this was the first time in my life my sensitivities were deadened. And I liked that at the time. Out of desperation, I turned to chemicals to repress my sensitivities. And I would have continued down that path had not fate or destiny or my own protection or my own guidance intervened. And that came in the form of an automobile accident. I was in a house in Santa Monica late one night when I was 16 years old, partying at a friend's house. I met this man I was very attracted to, jumped in a car in the middle of the night with him and headed up to Tuna Canyon, which is one of the darkest and the tallest, most desolate mountains in the Santa Monica mountain range. And so we were winding up this very huge road, going very high, and we were talking to one another, not paying much attention to the road. We get to the top, and all I remember is the shrieking sound of the car as we tumbled over this huge dark abyss, tumbling over 8 times. And as we were tumbling over, I remember seeing the moonlight streaming out of the windows. And then I was catapulted into this completely different realm. It was a long cylindrical tunnel. It was gleaming gray, beautiful, shining, protective. It was like a cashmere blanket wrapping me on a winter night. It was this incredible place that held me in safe sanctuary as we tumbled over the cliff. It was only when the car jolted to a halt that I came back into my own body remarkably unscathed. So this was an accident where we should have been harmed, we could have been paralyzed or killed, but in fact we were not. And so it was after this night that my life really began to change. And it's after these kinds of experiences, this was a near-death experience or powerful visionary experiences, that our protection can kick in ways that defies our own will. And it could come in to care for us and to direct us to our own calling. And this is what happened to me. So as a result of the accident, my parents forced me to go see a psychiatrist, which was the last thing I wanted to do.
But you were at that time evidencing all the symptoms of being a disturbed adolescent.
Absolutely, I really was, and there was a lot of danger involved. And so my parents, trying to be protective and caring, sent me to a psychiatrist. I could have very well been sent to a traditional psychiatrist who would have either given me Thorazine to medicate my symptoms or overanalyzed my experiences and diminished the energy and importance of them. But as fate would have it, I was sent to this incredible man who was able to see me and see that I was having psychic experiences and see that I was not handling them very well, and was able to recognize them and legitimize them, and in fact then send me over to see Dr. Thelma Moss at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, who tested my abilities and reaffirmed them even more by asking me to work as a psychic and a research assistant in her lab. So it was really a number of events that transformed my fate, which could have gone in a totally different direction.
Yeah. Well, Thelma Moss was in many ways a beacon of light, one might say, at UCLA.
Quite so, quite so. A beacon of light, a maverick in her time, just such a courageous researcher. To have her laboratory space at UCLA, which was a tiny little laboratory in the midst of this huge looming brick UCLA. And it had 2 Formica desks, a couple of phones, one huge sensory deprivation chamber in the middle of this lab where the Carillion photographic work was done.
And we should explain, Carillion photography is, it's not too common anymore.
No, not so much anymore, but it's thought to measure the energy fields around the body and inanimate objects. And that was much of Thelma's work.
It's very controversial today.
It
People,
is.
even after dozens of years of research, I think the scientific community hasn't quite accepted it. But the photographs themselves are stunning and would appear to be very much akin to what psychics call the aura.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even if the Carillion work is not documented, I know just as a clairvoyant, sensing energy fields, that they exist and they're there. And so the Carillion work really gives us a point with which to reference these auric fields.
It's unfortunate that we don't have photographs to show right now, but I think
yes.
the key point is that within this laboratory at UCLA, and as I recall, you were still a teenager.
I was. I was still a teenager in this new world of psychics and healers and scholars and people who would come through the lab that I could talk to about my experiences, who would understand them, who would give me reference points, who wouldn't be judging me or calling me strange or weird.
And validation.
Validation.
Yeah.
It was so important. It was such a huge opening for me to have that experience with Thelma. And in fact, when I was working with Thelma, I had a psychic dream in which a genderless voice came to me, told me very specifically that I was to become a psychiatrist in order to have the credentials to legitimize the whole psychic realm.
So in a sense now you are in a position where you can do for others what Thelma Moss was able to do for you at UCLA.
Absolutely. It's about regenerating what is given to us all the time and sharing that support with others and encouraging them to develop their own psychic experiences and their visionary side and their sense of inner calling and connection to spirit.
And at UCLA, working with Thelma, you had an opportunity to engage in a more disciplined exercise of your clairvoyant abilities.
Exactly, and I began to consciously channel it, to consciously do psychic readings, to apply it to projects, to do Carillion work, and to begin to come to terms with my abilities and see them as natural and wonderful and not over-glorify them either. To come into a very natural and balanced view of my abilities, that's where the process began.
You also were engaged in some research with Thelma on the process of psychic healing, didn't you?
Yes, definitely. I watched various healers come and work in the lab in the Carillion chamber, and I saw how they put their hands over people, and through the result of a loving touch and a grand connection to spirit, I saw them balance people's energies and heal in many cases. So this was quite miraculous to feel the quality of love that comes through healers, through authentic healers as they work. So it was that the whole arena of healing was opened up to me. And the whole idea that we can channel love through these vessels, the vessel of our human body, to create good and healing and balance for others.
So finally, after all of the struggle and therapy that you had gone through, you were in an environment that was providing you with legitimization, validation, training, encouragement, and it was then that you decided to, sort of like Daniel in the lion's den, go back and get a medical degree and return to a world in which psychic functioning was not regarded as valid.
Oh, as an alien life form. Psychic functioning is not considered as existent in traditional medicine. But I knew enough to listen to my dreams at that point, and I had been out of school. So I made a bargain with myself that I would enroll in a junior college, take one class, and see how it went. I wasn't at all sure that this experiment would succeed.
Yes.
And so I enrolled in this one course, the most unlikely course. It was a geography course, something I was not interested in. I remember going the first day of class, and the teacher began talking about how rain was formed and how clouds were made and thunderstorms and lightning and stars and the universe and the earth, and I was awestruck. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. And so my course of medical education began, and the initial impetus of the psychic dream propelled me through 14 years of medical training.
That's really quite an accomplishment. My hats go off to anybody who can survive medical school.
It's true, but when there's a certain destiny or calling involved, we can overcome the most severe of obstacles on the basis of listening to that calling. There's really
but
a lot
at the
of power.
same time, once again, as I understand your autobiography, you almost of necessity had to shut down quite a bit of your own clairvoyant functioning.
I did. The irony was I strayed very far from the psychic during my medical training and became entranced with the whole world of science and rationality and the biology of how the body works and how it contributes to so-called mental disorders. I became seduced and very knowledgeable about giving out medications such as antidepressants, lithium, anti-anxieties. I remember working in the affective disorder clinic there, which really treats people with depression and manic depression. The people would come in very debilitated, and we would give out medications, they would get better. And I saw this time and again. No one would come in for therapy. They would come in 15 minutes a month. I would listen to their symptoms, dole out medication, and see them get better. So when I opened up my traditional practice of psychiatry in Los Angeles, I had every intention of giving out medication, doing psychotherapy, working in inpatient units, and having a very traditional practice. I had strayed far from the psychic. I had begun to equate it with the psychotics who came in who were so out of balance. And I began to question whether or not it was really okay to explore these realms, whether it was safe.
Well, and let's look at that very carefully, because there does seem to be a gray area where, on the one hand, you have some people who are really psychic, but they seem almost psychotic, and then you have people who are really psychotic, and they seem almost psychic.
Well, there are some psychotics who are psychic. And I know in the Spiritual Emergence Network, they teach people to work with psychotics as a spiritual intervention to help with the psychic opening. But that isn't always appropriate as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there's some psychotics that do come in where it's appropriate to work on grounding, on being in the world, and working on personal hygiene and getting a job. And to focus overly on the metaphysical is throwing off the balance as far as I'm concerned. But this angers people, many people who are in the psychotic state, because they want to focus on talking to God, want to focus on predictions, apocalyptic predictions, many of them. And it really throws the balance so off to do that. So there's a lot of resistance to working on just grounding techniques, which is so necessary in terms of having the stability to deal with the psychic.
I mean, I suppose that but for fate, you yourself could have been pushed closer to psychosis as your own experiences were opening up.
It's very true, but I was very fortunate to have the grounding, to have the loving eyes of people around me, at least in the beginning, initially. But as I went through my medical training, I strayed so far from the psychic, and I had no intention really of bringing it back.
And do you think that in our culture, where there's so much controversy and confusion and fear around psychic functioning, that a lot of this is related to the way in which it seems to resemble mental illness?
Yes, exactly, and we're not giving any kind of prototype to describe psychic functioning in a positive, healthy way. I mean, if psychiatric residents were taught to do intuitive diagnosis or taught to tune into their patients intuitively, it would be the most natural thing in the world for them to learn, and hopefully I will be able to facilitate that kind of teaching one day. But now it's looked at as alien.
Yeah. I mean, I can well imagine some person, and I hear it all the time, when people begin to open up, they say, you know, this sounds crazy, but.
Yeah, exactly. They have to preface it with, this sounds crazy, but. But if there were a few physicians who were able to come out and talk about their experiences in a grounded way to just teach this to the medical students, it would be a terrific thing.
Grounded.
Yes.
Tell me, what does grounded mean in this context?
Grounded means looking at the psychic at a very reasonable perspective, not over glorifying it, dealing with the practical world, dealing with being human, but also admitting and accepting that we have these visionary abilities that we can put to practical use that I see are connected to the spiritual, very intimately connected to our link to God or whatever higher power, whatever term you would like to use.
There is a sense amongst many psychotic people and people suffering from mental illness that there's an ego identification with the functioning, that they often think it makes them special, and so they get delusions of grandeur or delusions of persecution based on their psychic functioning, rather than just taking it in a sort of more matter-of-fact way.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's why it's very difficult to work with in the context of psychosis. But once a person who's going through the psychotic process becomes more grounded, then it might be more appropriate at that particular time to bring it in. But the timing is critical when a therapist will bring in the psychic into the work. And that window of opportunity and appropriateness has to be there, and you could sense that as a therapist. And to bring it in at the wrong time can sometimes do damage.
Yeah. even with a client who you think is genuinely functioning in a psychic manner.
Yes, well sometimes, yes, if that opening or that window of opportunity is not there, if the time isn't right, it's not right to explore it. But if the time is right, it can be quite a glorious thing.
And now in your practice as a psychiatrist, that glorious thing plays a big role in the work you do with people.
Oh, a huge role. I use the psychic with every patient that I sit with. I use it from the very first moment I sit with them as I'm listening psychically. I work with them using dreams. I don't only sit with them for 45 minutes once a week. We're connected on an inner level. I can dream about them. I could tune into them during the week. We can communicate on an inner level. All of this is perfectly natural and a wonderful adjunct to psychotherapy.
In some sense, though, I can imagine many traditional therapists saying this is countertransference, meaning it's a violation of the normal boundaries.
Oh yes, yes. Well, they would say that. And in a sense, it is an expansion of the normal boundaries. I definitely don't feel it's a violation. It's a wonderful expansiveness, and it's a way to empower clients so that they know they have these abilities inside of themselves, so they can leave therapy and find their inner voice and listen to it and have faith and trust in it.
Judith Orloff, what a pleasure to learn about the work you're doing. Thanks so much for being with me.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jeffrey.
And for our viewers, I'd like to encourage you to check your listings to find out when part 2 of this 2-part series on psychiatry and the psychic realm will be available. Thank you for being with us.